Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Clifton Beck. Okay, not really. Clifton is on a well-deserved break today, but he'll be here with us in spirit. And he'll also be here with us by video a little later on in the show. So, my name is Renee Tomlinson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today on the ESCO HVAC show. With me today, the true star of the show, my
Wait a
teammate,
minute.
my colleague, the one and only Jason Upjute.
Hello,
Jason, thank
Renee.
you for joining me today. It's great to
Thanks
have
for
you
having
here.
me. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Happy to be on the show today.
So let's talk a little bit why we're here today.
Today we're going to discuss the F word.
The F word. The F word.
Yes, the F word as it relates to our industry. I know what you're all thinking, and it's not that one.
And not that one either.
Yes. All right.
Not
We're
that
going to
one.
talk about a little bit of flammability. And under what conditions certain things are going to become flammable. Because under the right conditions, anything can become flammable.
True. Very true. And thinking about we're making a big deal out of the flammability of these new refrigerants as they're coming out into the industry, or they have been in the industry for many, many years. But the truth is that all the refrigerants that we've been working with for many, many years are all flammable under the right conditions. So that's what we're going to focus on a little bit today. But before we get started into that, don't forget to tell us where you're joining us from today. And as always, if you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to get them in that chat. So, Jason, are you ready to roll?
I'm as ready as I'm going to be for this. Let's give it a whirl and see what happens, right?
Let let's do it. Let's go.
Before we get started, if we have a mistake again, we're learning the buttons in the studio again for the two of us here. So um, submit your questions. We'll do our best to get to them in the time that we have allotted to us today. We have a beautiful little video starring our true movie star, Mr. Clifton Beck, that we're going to present to you today. So we're hoping that a lot of questions will be answered during that video, and then they're probably going to generate a lot more questions, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can.
Absolutely. I'll be interrupting Jason during his presentation to ask your questions. So again, feel free to jump in with any questions that you have.
All right, so we're first going to dive into why these refrigerants, the flammable refrigerants, if you will, are seeing expanded use in our industry, and it has a lot to do with the regulatory landscape and our climate and some of the things that have come our way either via the EPA or through Congress, acts of legislation, those things. We are currently experiencing a refrigerant transition, and it's a little different from previous transitions where it's a phase down instead of a phase out. We saw with the CFCs and the HCFCs that these refrigerants were eventually phased out, meaning we weren't going to import anymore, we weren't going to make anymore. Whatever we had in the chain is what we had in the supply chain, and the future supplies of those refrigerants rely on us as technicians to recover this refrigerant and bring it in for reclamation. The HFC phase down that we're experiencing is exactly that, a phase down. We're not going to go to a net zero. It'll be an 85% phase down. So there will still be what we call a service gas percentage left in the chain to service legacy equipment. You can go ahead to the next one, Renee.
Yep.
So a lot of this particular phase down is based on global warming potential, or GWP, whereas in previous phase outs, we were worried about ozone depletion potential. This particular phase down, again, targets refrigerants based on their GWP. And what a GWP is, it's a metric used to measure a chemical's ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. And for comparison, CO2 has a GWP of 1. If we look at the the graphic up here, we can see 410A has a GWP of 2088. And what that means is 410A, when released into the atmosphere, can trap or hold 2088 times as much heat as CO2 by itself over a 100-year period. So when we see these extremely large numbers from some of these HFCs like 410A or 404A, this is one of the main reasons they're being, again, phased down. If we look at some of the refrigerants, the mildly A2L refrigerants, mildly flammable, or the highly flammable A3 refrigerants, we can see that they have very low GWPs. Typically what happens is as GWP comes down, flammability tends to come up. And as we move forward into this transition and this phase down, we're going to see that a lot of these refrigerants that we're left with after we phase down again based on GWP, a lot of what we're left with is going to be flammable. There's the F word in one form or another. Again, there's a few levels of flammability, and we're going to touch on that as well. We have to stop throwing the F word at every refrigerant that's flammable. There are various levels of flammability, from mildly flammable to highly flammable. And we'll discuss why each refrigerant gets the label that it does. So the most recent piece of legislation that initiated this phase down, if you will, is the AIM Act. It was passed through the Senate, the Congress, signed by the president, and it's a reduction in HFC consumption and import. And the question comes, when does it start? Well, it already started. It started back in 2022 with a 10% reduction. January 1 next year, that reduction jumps to 40%. So if you didn't notice or feel the hurt from a rise in price in some of the HFCs this past year, you're probably going to experience that January 1 next year. And again, it'll end off with about a total of an 85% reduction in HFCs. This is not across the board. The way this is being done is, again, based on the GWP. There is an allotment similar to a bank account. And the EPA allots each manufacturer, importer, what have you, a certain number of credits, if you will, like your bank account. And each tank of refrigerant that you make pulls from that account. So the higher the GWP of the refrigerant, the more credits it takes from your account. So it's going to be up to the manufacturers to decide what they want to manufacture and what they're going to slowly, if you will, phase down or out. We're going to see that the higher GWP refrigerants are going to be pushed to the side in favor of lower GWP refrigerants, which they can make more of given their bank account or their allotment, if you will.
So, Jason, one of the things you touched on was you talked about the difference in price already with the
Yes.
refrigerants. So, what is something that we as an industry can do to make sure that there's a continual supply? It may not necessarily help the prices, but it might if there's more refrigerant available than
We can
not.
recover and bring it in for reclamation. There is this big fallacy out there that if you have mixed refrigerant, it has to be destroyed. It can't be separated and returned to new refrigerant, ARI 700 standard refrigerant. And that's completely wrong. We have the technology today, the reclaimers do, to take mixed refrigerants, separate them, and put them out as clean refrigerant again. So one way to ease the pressure on pricing and availability and supply is to recover the refrigerant and bring it in for reclamation. And a lot of these reclaimers are paying decent money, good money for a lot of these refrigerants, especially the HFCs during this phase down. So we got to stop seeing it as a roadblock or a bump in the road and start seeing it as a commodity that's available for a revenue stream as a contractor or as a technician. That there's money sitting in that line, that we can recover that refrigerant, bring it in for reclamation, and it stays in the economy.
Mm-hmm.
So as we mentioned, this is a phase down, not a phase out. The previous CFC and HCFC were phase outs. We can see in the graphic that they went from 100% to 0% over a period of time. This one goes from 100% down to 15%, again, over a shorter period of time. So there will be a small supply left, about 15%, over say between now and 2036. Again, it started in 2022, and the next big step is January 1 next year. So what does this affect? Well, if we look at the graphic shown here, we have 410A on the top, which is a mixture of R125 and R32, a 50-50 mix. And the one below it is a mixture of R32 and R1234YF HFO, which is R454B. We pointed out earlier that 125 or 410A, if you will, has a GWP of 2088, whereas R32 has a GWP of about 676. So when we get into that allocation and availability, we're going to see a lot more of the 454B, which is mildly flammable, than we will of the 410A, just because of the credits it takes to produce these refrigerants.
Awesome. I just want to shout out here, and I have to interrupt the show to actually show this one on screen. So Jason has a fan watching, so I just had to say hi. So.
Hi, bud. One of the other things, these next two slides we're going to go over are more proposed rules, more things coming from the EPA. This is the technology transition proposed rule. And what this does is limit for new equipment, given a year, the GWP of the refrigerant allowed to be used in that application. And one of the focuses here, again, I'll focus in on the residential light commercial air conditioning systems. The maximum GWP for a refrigerant in that application is 700. Again, this is proposed. It should be finalized in October. But you can see for each and every aspect, sector and subsector of the industry, they've put a GWP limit for new equipment. So as of January 1, 2025, for residential light commercial air conditioners and heat pumps, new equipment has to run on a refrigerant that has a GWP of 700 or less. All right. That knocks everything out that we've looked at, all the HFCs that we've looked at thus far, except for R32, which is a 676. 454B, which is a combination of R32 and 1234YF, is in the 400 range. Both of those are mildly flammable. So in a lot of these applications, we're going to see flammable or highly flammable or mildly flammable refrigerants being deployed to satisfy this requirement.
A lot of changes, huh?
It
A
is.
lot of
There's 3
changes.
pages. This is just one page of 3. And then most recently, the EPA put out a proposed rule, SNAP 26. And again, it dealt with about 10 different refrigerants, and all of those refrigerants were either mildly flammable A2L or highly flammable A3s. And what it did was approve for use in specific applications these refrigerants. And one of the big things to note here was propane, which is an A3 highly flammable refrigerant, was approved for larger charge sizes in new equipment moving forward. Again, proposed rule. So when I say approved, proposal to be approved. And we went to 300 grams for what's called a closed system that has doors or drawers where the refrigerant can be trapped inside, or an open system, which is 500 grams. And open is something you can reach in and grab the product out of. It's a lot higher than the 150 grams that we previously saw. And again, it's in very specific applications, but we're seeing a lot more SNAP rulings and approvals for mildly flammable and highly flammable refrigerants in a variety of applications, again, to meet that GWP requirement.
So with this being a proposed rule, obviously it's not in effect as of yet.
Right.
How does that work? What is the difference between when a rule is proposed and when it actually becomes a law?
So the standards that govern the equipment covered by this ruling have been updated and allow for this charge. The second step is it goes to SNAP for approval. SNAP will put out a proposed rule, and then there's a comment period where anyone in the industry can log in and submit a comment in support or against the ruling, and then give a reason why. EPA then closes the comment period, looks over all of the comments. If there's nothing serious that needs to be addressed in those comments, then the ruling can become finalized. if there's some serious concern, something that wasn't thought of or something they didn't foresee, then they may adjust the proposed rule and then publish a finalized rule with some changes to the original.
Oh, that is good information to know. So when we announce or when we notify you that there's some proposed law, it's to keep you in up to date with what's happening and what's coming down the pike. So just because it says proposed doesn't mean you shouldn't be paying attention, because odds are that it's going to come to fruition, whether it may be slightly modified, because sometimes that's what happens. That's why it goes through the proposal process. There's comment period times and things, but we try our best to make sure that we're keeping these things and this information in front of you constantly. So I see we're talking about these flammability classes up next.
So I've been throwing around some big words and some letters and numbers, and I just want to break down where all of this comes from. You've heard me say A2L, A3, highly flammable, mildly flammable, and this comes from ASHRAE Standard 34. And again, it depends on the characteristics and the conditions under which a refrigerant is either toxic or flammable. Flammability is represented with a number 1, 2L, 2, and 3, and toxicity is represented with a letter, either A or B. And depending on how these perform during tests, it will dictate which designation it gets. So we're going to discuss the differences, and we're going to actually see those differences on display today in a little pre-prepared video that our Rockstar put together for us. But I want to say that just because if we look at the bottom category, there are no flame propagation, R22, R4, 10A, they're A1s. A1 means no, it does not mean non-flammable. It means no flame propagation. That means under a specific set of circumstances, this refrigerant didn't sustain ignition. That doesn't mean under a different set of circumstances that refrigerant will not become flammable, because there are a variety of conditions in which it will. For example, a house fire. During a house fire, what we call a total loss where the entire structure is burning, that refrigerant in that line will become flammable under those conditions. The flame is hot enough, the conditions are such that the refrigerant will become flammable, as well as the oil inside the system. So there's a lot of things. So when we say it's an A1, stop using the word non-flammable, and stop using the word flammable for that matter. It's either highly flammable, mildly flammable, low flammability. There are various levels of flammability. Not everything has to have that F word thrown at it.
the
So
infamous the infamous
yes,
F word.
there are various levels of it, so to speak. And what they do is it's an ASHRAE Standard 34 ISO test where the refrigerant is pumped into a flask with air, and there's electrodes, and it's ignited, and there's an arc, as you can see painted there, a 90-degree arc to see the spread of the flame. They're measuring things like heat of combustion, some of the byproducts of combustion. A lot of different things are being monitored to see into which bucket is this going to fall, the A1, the A2L, the A2, or the A3. But it is a very complex test, and there's a lot of things that are being monitored when they do this. Shown in this slide are some of the refrigerants, again, being tested in the flask. We can see 1, 2L, and 3, and you can see the difference in the flame, the spread of the flame, the breadth of the flame, if you will. So again, we're looking at that 90-degree arc. We have 2L, which is mildly or lower flammability. We have 2, which is low flammability or flammable. And we have 3, which is high flammability. So some of the refrigerants that we threw out already, like 454B or R32 or 1234YF, those are 2L refrigerants. Propane, isobutane, those are higher flammability A3 refrigerants. There's a big difference between them. We're going to see that on display in a little bit here.
Yes, we will.
So to show you some of the, again, this is a still photo, but you'll see it in action later. On the far, the A2L refrigerant, we have 1234YF, which is in a lot of places. If you have a car that was manufactured in the last 5-7 years, it's most likely got 1, 2, 3, 4 YF in the AC system. R32, which is a really big refrigerant in mini splits already. And then on the right-hand side there, R290, which is refrigerant grade propane. And you can see the burning velocity, the flame. The best way I can describe the flame of an A2L is if you were trying to ignite and burn an A2L refrigerant, you're probably going to be disappointed in the result. It's a very lazy, very slow, very poor looking flame. It's not going to be the whoosh of an A3.
So, and this is why it's important for us to keep having these conversations as well, talking about what these varying levels of flammability are, because there's been conversations and debates about safety and why are we introducing things that are going to blow up our houses and these have literally been the conversations,
Yes,
right?
they have.
When the reality is our houses are already sitting on natural gas pipelines,
Or propane
uh,
tanks in the yard.
right?
The refrigerator that we bought in the last 7-8 years has propane inside it or isobutane inside of it. Our cars have an A2L in there. Window units and little package units have R32 in them, again, an A2L. So they've been on the periphery for quite some time, and they're now starting to work their way into the mainstream. And one of the reasons we want to talk about this is there's a huge difference between the requirements and the protocol and the things that we're supposed to do between an A2L, an A2, and an A3. A3 are charge restricted. There's a size restriction on the charge size, minimum room area required. There's a lot to know there, specific tools, and there is with A2Ls as well, but on a very different scale. So we need to know. If we just throw the flammable moniker on everything that's out there, we're not going to know how to handle the different chemicals, and they do need to be handled quite differently. Having said that, we're going to see what happens. I'll throw this out there. There's two things I want to put out there about this little video we're about to see. One, there is a disclaimer, and if you do have time, go back and read it again. You'll see it this time, but again, when it's posted, go back and read it again. And two, no furnaces, air conditioners, or heat pumps were harmed in the making of this video. But what we're going to see is just how flammable some of these chemicals are. And you're going to see the difference, the large difference between an A1, an A2L, and an A3. A1, again, no flame propagation, supposedly. A2L, mildly flammable, and A3, highly flammable. And we're going to see just how vastly different these refrigerants are. Everyone, again, as you mentioned, a lot of the conversation, everyone just keeps throwing the word flammable out there, and a lot of folks don't understand the difference in levels of flammability. There's a massive difference in levels of flammability, and this video is going to do a great job demonstrating just what we've been explaining here today.
And as I mentioned at the beginning, Clifton would be joining us in spirit. So thanks for preparing this in advance for us to show today. Here we go.
Okay, I've got a torch. I have an A1, an A2, an A2L, and an A3. You want to go see what they actually look like under fire? Oh yeah. Did you know that all refrigerants are actually flammable? Maybe not as flammable as you would think. A lot of times you and I think of flammability as either it lights, it ignites, or it doesn't, right? Well, that's really not the case. We know from the combustion triangle that we have to have three important things. We have to have fuel, we have to have oxygen, and we have to have our ignition source. Well, how much fuel, how much oxygen, how much ignition, and at what pressure, right? There are a lot of variables out there. So we're going to talk about the different flammabilities of refrigerants to have a better understanding of how this all looks when we're out into the field, out in the industry. So ASHRAE sets the standard for all of our refrigerants. We basically have two letters, A and B, and 4 numbers, 1, 2, 2L, and 3. So the AB, that's for our toxicity. 1 is no flame propagation, 2, 2L, and then 3, right? 3 being highly flammable with lots of propagation. There's actually a lot of different scenarios in between, but we're basically going to look at 4 primary classifications, all built from ASHRAE. So all the refrigerants that we currently know, as well as all the refrigerants that could be coming in the future, will all be based on that application. Well, what does it look like though, right? To you and me. Now we have wonderful friends in the industry from like Chemours and even Honeywell who shows us in a lab what that looks like. And we've seen YouTube videos of people, shooting flames out of different things, being able to kind of look at that. But we have to remember, all refrigerants, classified refrigerants, are regulated by Section 608 of the Clean Air Act. That's what our Section 608 license is for, right? To make sure that we don't knowingly release refrigerants. So that is our regulated refrigerants. But did you know that other industries are also going through the exact same phase down? Did you even know that other industries use the same chemicals that we do? One very popular one is the aerosol and the foam blowing applications. They've went through all of these phase downs and phase outs that we've seen over history. I mean, we used to use CFC-12 for refrigerant. Well, the aerosol industry used CFC-12 as a propellant for insecticides. We've used R22. We've used a variety of different refrigerants as propellants and aerosols over time. So other industries are going through this HFC phase down that started in January 1st of 2022, if you didn't know that. So the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol established the phase down of HFC refrigerants. We started with a 10% reduction of all HFCs January of 2022 by 10%. Anybody see the price of refrigerants go up last year? Yeah, absolutely. And I would say a pretty decent amount of that is because of our HFC phase down. I hope you're aware that January 1st of 2024, we're actually going to add a 30% reduction to those HFCs based on global warming potential. So a lot of our refrigerants are on this slide and they will be going away in the very near future. Some of the refrigerants that you know very well and very comfortably right now. So we have to get comfortable with all of this transition. We will have reduced those HFC refrigerants by 85%, which means they will almost be gone. So we have a variety of new refrigerants, and a typical balance to look at is the higher the global warming potential, the less the flammability. So as our global warming potential is coming down, our flammability is going up. But remember, what does that look like? And what does that look like to us in the field? Well, we are restricted from knowingly releasing regulated refrigerants, but what about those other industries? All right, that's a little bit of a loophole for us to do some testing and to understand what these HFC refrigerants look like. Actually, a variety of different refrigerants, not just HFCs, but HFOs and our HC refrigerants. So we've got a few of them to work with here, right? So we're going to do some experimenting to get an understanding of what these look like in the field. We're going to take a look at tetrafluoroethane. Any ideas what this might look like? In the world of refrigerants, this would actually be 134A. But since it's used in an aerosol, it is not a regulated refrigerant in this application. Okay? We also have, this one might not be as familiar to you, difluoroethane. This would actually be R152A. You're probably not very familiar with that, but this is an A2. Remember, our 134A was an A1. This is an A2, so it is a mildly flammable refrigerant. We've actually looked at using this in automotive air conditioning and it didn't really happen. But now we have it that we can experiment with. Here's one that really is going to be fun to play with. All right, so this one is tetrafluoropropene. Any ideas? This is actually 1234YF, our newer HFO refrigerant. Now, what is an HFO? You want to know? An HFO is kind of an HFC in disguise. What I mean by that is when we look at the composition of our molecule of an HFC chemical, we have carbon atoms at the core, and then we have hydrogen, and we have fluorine, hydrofluorine. fluorocarbon, right? Now, depending on how many atoms we have of each one will depend on the actual chemical name and state. And it also changes the stability of the chemical, especially when we're going from a liquid to a gas state. That really has effect on the strength of the bonds within our entire molecule. Well, we needed to get to a lower global warming potential refrigerant. So scientists at the Chemours company were able to modify the bonds and use in chemistry what is known as an alkene or olefin bond between our carbon atoms. So it changes the strength and the structure of those. Now, we do still have hydrogen and we do still have fluorine, so we have a hydrofluorocarbon. It is just bonded with an olefin bond, which means it doesn't have the same stability as it changes states from liquid to gas in the atmosphere, right? Keeping it confined within a refrigeration system, it's just going back and forth like all other chemicals. If it happens to get into the atmosphere, our bond is not going to be as strong. The covalent bond is not going to hold together as well. It's going to break apart and it is going to dissolve in the atmosphere, which is why we have such a lower global warming potential of this. This gas doesn't stay in the atmosphere the way our previous HFCs did. So that is the design of your HFO. It still is using hydrogen, fluorine, and carbon. It's just done in a very different way. Has a very low global warming potential, and we're going to see a lot more of that. And then we have our A3. Now this is actually propane, so it's got things like sulfur dioxide and it has different odorants in it, has impurities in it. If this was completely purified into its cleanest form, we would recognize this as R290. It's just propane, right? Hydrocarbon, A3 highly flammable. So we have all four classifications, A1, A2, A2L, A3, and we're going to go see what they actually look like in real-world scenarios that you might encounter out in the field. Now, the thing to think about with refrigerants is that we're talking about the stability of a chemical. So the place that you're going to experience ignition the most is when we change state, right? When we change state from a liquid to a vapor, that's when our energy is going to be expanding, our gases are going to be expanding, and you have the most potential for ignition. But in that expansion, it has to be a pretty specific combination of fuel, oxygen, and our ignition source. So, are you ready? Huh? Oh yeah. Let's go see what we can do with all four classifications of refrigerant. Okay, before it gets too dark, I wanted to show you what we're going to be using for this experiment. We have our A1, our A2, our A2L, as well as our A3 flammability chemicals. We're going to be using three different ignition sources that are going to be common to equipment that we know. A silicon carbide igniter, a silicon nitride igniter, as well as a direct spark ignition using a Honeywell ignition module. So we're going to see what we have for flammability on these four different classifications of flammable gases. All right, let's light this stuff up. So we're going to start with our 134A. It's about 80 degrees outside, so we should have about 100 psi in this can. We're going to use the trigger to adjust the velocity a little bit, and yeah, nothing lit so far. And let's move on to our 152A. Should be around 90 psia. Different velocities with the trigger. Yeah, still nothing. Okay, let's move on to our 1234YF. Should be around 104 psia. We're going to get this sucker really hot. And yeah, still nothing. We can boil some sap out of the mahogany bit, and we can't get that 1234YF to light. What about some propane? R290, around 144. Of course, we're reducing down with our regulator, but you can see that our propane lights pretty easy, and propagation is pretty high with a highly flammable gas. Okay, what about an open flame? We'll start with our 134A again, and yeah, there's nothing going on in there. So let's move on to our 152, our A2. Yeah, I actually get just a little bit of flutter in that flame. Not a lot, but we can see a little bit. How about our A2L? Yeah, almost nothing. Okay. Okay, let's invert this can and see what happens when we go from liquid to vapor. Oh, looky there. A little bit of ignition on this igniter. Not on that one, and nothing on the intermittent ignition. Okay, now let's try our A2, our 152A. Holy HFCs, Batman! Look at that flame. And that is with an A2 as it's converting from liquid to vapor, and not so much on ignition. And the moment we've all been waiting for, our A2L. And not really a whole lot. More like an A1. There's a little bit of flutter, but absolutely nothing on our electronic ignition. Oh, if I get it just right. And super, super hot ignition. Okay, let's see what happens with a direct flame. So our 134A, yeah, I mean, there's a little bit in there. Not a lot, but a little bit. And as we increase our velocity, our propagation actually goes down. Well, what about our 152? Yeah, that's a lot of flammability. That was our A2. Let's take a look at our A2L, and, well, yeah, there's a little bit. So a little bit more than an A1, but definitely not as much as an A2.
So what does all this mean? Well, it really means that all refrigerants really are flammable. It just depends on the amount of fuel, the amount of oxygen, and the energy, and the amount of that energy that is in our ignition source. So when we look at our refrigerants, we need to understand that even our A1 refrigerants, this 134A, did ignite when it was in the right circumstance. It had to be changing state from liquid to vapor. All of our refrigerants here are showing examples of propagation when they're changing state from liquid to vapor in an open flame ignition source. Now, we didn't see those similar effects when we're talking about vapor, and we didn't see as much of it when we're talking about liquid in lower ignition sources, like our hot surface igniter and with our direct spark ignition. Very different ignition scenarios. So just be aware that all of our refrigerants have some type of flammability to them. Our A2L actually is much closer to an A1 than it is like the A2, and definitely nowhere near the A3. It doesn't have a lot of flame to it. And if you notice, when we start applying more pressure, more velocity to the refrigerant itself, our flame propagation actually diminished. So the window's very, very small. So a lot closer. I would actually rather seen this A2L down here close to our A1 and our A2 up here really close to our A3. But that's just the scenario that I see. So thanks for joining us. If you want to use any of this footage, please do. No need to duplicate it. You know, we took a lot of extra safety precautions to make sure that we had a proper atmosphere to do this testing. We're on concrete. We have all highly flame resistant clothing, fire extinguisher, and it's just a great opportunity for us to experiment with the true flammability of these refrigerants in real world scenarios. Have a good day.
Wowie, wowie.
Yeah, for real, right?
And he's not even here, and he's still the star of the show.
I know, right? He did a lot of work there. He did a lot of preparation. A lot of safety precautions were put in place to make that video. A lot of research put into it. I definitely, again, as he said, feel free to use it. Use the disclaimer before it, but it did show a lot of things that we've been saying. There's already questions rolling in about will it sustain combustion? And A2L, once the ignition source is removed, will not sustain the combustion. An A3 will, a highly flammable A3 will sustain its own combustion. One of the things that we saw from there is, again, an A2L is a lot closer to an A1 than it is to an A2 or even an A3. The flame is very minimal. He had three different igniters on there, and we saw with the high voltage spark, I don't think the only one that really lit up was the propane that really sustained itself. But as you can see, there's a huge difference. What we've been trying to say, the F word, the flammable word, there's a big difference between A1, A2L, A2, and A3, and the conditions under which they are flammable, what we consider standard operating or normal operating conditions. That's not always the case in the field. We're going to come across some outside the ordinary conditions under which things that normally wouldn't be flammable become flammable. So as he said, there's a very small window there for the mildly flammable A2Ls to both achieve ignition and continue ignition. One of those, again, comes down to the velocity of the refrigerant, the strength of the ignition source, the burning velocity of the gas itself. There's a lot that comes into play with that. And this video does a really good job of demonstrating just how big of a difference there is from A1 all the way up to A3.
What was it he said? Holy HFC Batman?
Yes, that was, we're going to have to get a shirt made now for that.
Yeah,
He's going to have to wear it.
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And if you do have other questions, again, feel free to jump in the chat and put them down. We'll do our best to address them as we move forward.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that comes up then is, what does this mean for me in the field? We're obviously not going to be standing in the field with a tank of refrigerant, spraying it over an open flame. These are, again, he was trying to present real world scenarios, ignition sources, possible ignition sources, and HVAC equipment with a refrigerant leak nearby. And we saw the levels of flammability there. So once these hit the field, what are some of the things that me as a contractor, technician, instructor, anyone in the industry, wholesaler, counter, wherever you're at in the industry, what types of changes are we going to see? And truth be told, when we're dealing with A2Ls, we're not going to see a huge difference. Units are still going to look like the units that they do today. We'll see some difference in the tanks. What we can see here is a tank of 407C and A1, and it has a rupture disc on there. And to the right, we have 1234YF, which has a pressure relief valve. And there's a big difference. The rupture disc, if it ruptures, everything that's on the inside of the tank is now going to be on the outside of the tank. There's no stopping it. On the A2L cylinders, we are not going to see rupture discs. We're going to see a spring-loaded pressure relief valve. And as the pressure in the tank rises, it'll open up, pressure will lower, the valve will close. It will not vent the entire contents of the tank outside of the tank unless, again, the pressure is extremely out of control. So that's one of the differences we're going to see. In an A1, we're using a rupture disc, and in an A2L on that tank, we're going to see a spring-loaded pressure relief valve at the top of the tank. One of the other differences we're going to see is the color code. We're going to see, I don't know if I've seen a lot of discussion on this about all the refrigerant tanks are gray now. Yes, that was an AHRI guideline change that all the tanks are going to a gray colored tank. But when we have a flammable tank, we're going to see that red band, either a red band or the entire top of the tank is red. We're also going to advise you, listen, a lot of us, when we were in the field, when we're getting ready to render the tank useless so that we can dispose of this tank, we would puncture the rupture disc and then recycle the tank. Don't attempt that with a spring-loaded pressure relief valve. You may shoot your eye out. All right. The proper way to do it would be to puncture it with a brass or non-sparking pick right there by the weld, as you can see. So again, we're going to see a difference in the color code. And one of the other differences in the tank that we're going to see, again, Chemours has announced that their tanks are going to have a left-handed thread. So that's, again, from a functionality standpoint, nothing that we've discussed changes the actual chemical itself, the refrigerant itself. These are all cosmetic changes, if you will. The color of the tank, where we puncture the tank, the thread on the tank. The refrigerant is still the refrigerant, all right? Just because a refrigerant is flammable does not mean the refrigeration cycle changes. Superheat is still superheat. Subcooling is still subcooling. The evaporator is still the evaporator. Nothing is going to change. A lot of these changes that we're going to see are just going to be simply cosmetic. And again, this is to alert you that, hey, something is different about this. It's trying to say to you, listen, look at me. I'm a little different. I work the same. I do the same thing, but I am a little different from something that you may have been handling last year.
Right, and then that's in addition to things like seeing the red striping throughout the system
Right.
and components that are encased, so there's no opportunity for sparking while the system is running. So again,
Intrinsically safe electrical
cosmetic,
components,
right?
right? Yes. A contactor still does contact, right? In that same vein, in that cosmetic change that we spoke of, we're going to see on these A2L units, we're going to see a lot of stickers and warnings and color coding. This doesn't change how the system works. A heat pump still pumps heat. An air conditioner still transfers heat from inside the structure to outside the structure. None of that has changed, but we're going to see a lot of stickers and a lot of things to raise our awareness that the fluid inside here, the refrigerant in here, is a little different from the refrigerant that we're used to using, that there is a level of flammability there, mildly flammable A2L in this system. So again, these are just stickers and warnings and things, but it doesn't change the way the system works. So in a lot of instances, we're still going to do the things that we do. We're still going to calculate superheat. We're still going to install the same way we install. All right. The systems themselves have not been radically redesigned to accommodate this flammable refrigerant. All right. We're still going to have the evaporator, the condenser, the metering device, compressor, all of these things. They're just going to have stickers and ratings on them to work with these newer refrigerants. They still do the same job they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Again, all cosmetic changes up to now. And finally, if and when I'm servicing these units, when I'm either doing an install or if I'm working on servicing a system currently in the field, what are some of the things I have to do? With A1 refrigerants, there were a lot of things that we would do that would be considered best practice that weren't required by code. They may have been required by manufacturer, but not necessarily by codes or standards. For example, evacuating a system or pressure testing and leak testing a system. These were considered best practice. And we all want to do what we're supposed to be doing and in deploying best practices when we're servicing or installing systems. However, with the A2L refrigerants, they are now required either by standard, by code, and or manufacturer. These are required. The reason I bring this up is if you are currently doing what we define as industry best practices, when you go to do an install of a system that runs on an A2L, you're not going to see a difference. The biggest difference is going to be before the system even hits the job site. It's evaluating that job site to make sure that it can satisfy the requirements of this A2L refrigerant. Once the equipment hits the job site, the install is the same. We're still going to braze the lines together. We're going to pressure test, leak test, evacuate, charges. All of that is the same. And again, if you've been using what we define as industry best practices, you're not going to see a difference in your install or service setup.
Awesome.
Do we have any questions up to now, or are we so far so good?
Well, that's what I was going to say, Jason. You must have either gone through it so well that nobody has any questions because you covered every possible thing that anybody wants to know, or they don't want to ask questions because they didn't want me to show you up on the knowledge, So,
Gotcha. I will put out there that one of the differences we're going to see from an A1 system to an A2L system is something called an RDS, or refrigerant detection system. And what this is, you can think of it as like a circuit board. If any of you are working on furnaces, we have something called a rollout switch. And if that rollout switch opens, it puts the furnace in the lockout, turns the blower motor on, the inducer motor on, just keeps air moving and locks the system out. It's something akin to that. We're going to have a sensor on the condenser, a sensor on the evaporator tied into some little circuit board. And if one of those sensors picks up a leak, it is going to put the system in the lockout, turn some fans on, keep the air moving, and stay locked out. The reason I bring this up is because the gas and go thing is going to have to go, so to speak. For those of us that come up to me, oh, it's a little low, let me put some refrigerant in there and I'll be on my way. That's not going to work. If there is a leak in this sensor is going to look every 10 to 15 seconds for a leak. And if it picks up a leak, it's going to lock out the system. So if you gas up this system and don't repair the leak, 10 seconds later, it's going to lock out again. So we are going to have to fix these leaks moving forward if the RDS is picking them up. So that is one big, and again, that'll be on board when you walk out of the supply house with the unit on your truck. You may have to connect a wire here or there or tie in a blower motor here or there, but it will have some sort of, and again, it'll vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. They will be able to best educate you on how their RDS works and how to respond to a fault code. 3 blinks means this, 4 blinks means that, those sort of things. But we are going to see those sorts of things on these A2L systems moving forward. I
So
wanted to get that out there.
how do you know all this, Jason?
Well, there was this bird, and no, I'm kidding. I sit in a lot of these committee meetings, a lot of the standards meetings. I'm either an observer or a participant, or in some cases, I was the chairman of certain committees like the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force for AHRI. I'm an observer on ASHRAE Standard 15 and 15.2. I'm on the code hearings, the ICC code hearings as an observer. So I sit in on a lot of the boring stuff to listen to what's going on. I monitor and follow all of the EPA proposed and final rules and try and, again, translate those into English for everybody else to understand, because a lot of times they're written in legal English, which nobody understands.
Right.
So there's a lot of boring work that goes in on the backside of this to be able to give you this information.
Well, I did think it was important for you to talk a little bit about that, so everybody understands why it is we go to the expert and have you talk about and help to explain these things to everybody out there, because you've been excuse me, sitting on the committees and doing the work, so that we could bring all this information to everyone out there. So I think what we're going to do here is, if anybody wants to learn more or participate in our online course, we have a low GWP refrigerant safety course, online course. You can scan the QR code. It'll take you right to the page where you can find that course. And additionally, if you did not know, there is the Did You Know ESCO HVAC podcast. So don't forget to tune in and listen to that. I believe we have a new episode airing almost every week now.
Yeah.
So a lot of great conversations, all in different topics and areas too, not just technical topics. We've got soft skills, we've got leadership, we've got talking about carbon monoxide safety. So it's just such a wide range of topics, whether you're involved in the HVACR industry or even not. A lot of these topics really pertain to everyone. So don't forget to join us for that podcast. You can listen in on your favorite podcast platform. We also have it on our e-learning network too. So Jason, is there anything else that you wanted to leave everybody with today?
There was a good question that just jumped into the
Oh,
chat, and how are they going to deal with the A2L and A3 refrigerants in service vehicles? So currently, DOT has a clause. It's called MOT, Materials of the Trade. And what that means is there's a certain allowance for what, say, welders and their welding gases, or HVAC folks and their brazing gases. We use oxygen and acetylene and propane torches and MAP gas torches. We drive around with all of these things right now, and we don't have to have placards or ventilation. So how do we do that? And it's under something called MOT, Materials of the Trade. And we're allowed up to 440 pounds, not in a single cylinder, mind you, 26 pounds or less, 26.1, I think it is, or less, before you have to be placarded and hazmated and those sorts of things. So the Materials of the Trade clause in the DOT CFR 49 allows us to drive around with about 440 pounds of, again, gases or fluids directly related to the trade. For example, a welder and the welding gases, or HVAC personnel and the brazing gases. We've been driving around with that. Again, those are way more flammable than the stuff that we were seeing in this video, oxygen and acetylene. And then those torches that, we saw Clifton using, the propane and the MAP gas, we're already driving around with those and have been for years. And we don't have to have placards or ventilation. I will say that they do require a fire extinguisher, a Class B or better fire extinguisher on board. A lot of vans do have passive ventilation in the top when you're driving around with those types of gases. That is an option, but again, not necessarily. There might be different requirements locally. You'll have to check again, locally with your code authority or the fire code about what they require when driving around. But federally, there's no requirement for placards until you hit that. Again, it's about, I want to say it's 440 pounds. After that, you're no longer a service technician. You're now a shipper. So I wanted to address that. And then the second one is, if you want more of this information, if you're looking to upskill, if you will, and get educated, we do have a conference every year. And there is a, do we have a code for that one, Renee?
Yep. Sorry, you were faster than me.
So we do have an educator conference. There's tons and tons of folks, really, really bright people that come out to share their knowledge with everybody on a wide variety of topics. And there's a schedule. You can pick and choose the different classes. It's a great time. A lot of networking that goes on between contractors, teachers, anyone related to the industry. There's a lot of people at this event. And if you're looking for more information, again, this is the place to go get it. I swear by it.
You wanna talk to these people firsthand. You wanna
Right.
talk to the refrigerant manufacturers. You wanna talk to other industry trainers. Hey, you wanna come talk to Jason? Stop by
I'll
our
be there,
conference.
yeah. But the tool manufacturers will show the latest tools, or equipment manufacturers show how their equipment is working. Trainers, just from one end of the industry to the other, there's a representative of somewhere in the industry at this conference, and it's to your benefit to check it out.
Absolutely. So we will say hello to a few people who've been popping in and saying hello. So Donald Baker, thanks for joining us. Paul
Hey, Don.
Leonardi, Peyton and Jason, thank you guys. Todd Clear, thank you all. If I missed any, Jeff Underwood. Yeah, thanks so much for checking in with us and joining us today. Jason, were there any last parting words you wanted to give everyone?
I want you to think of an education or getting trained as an investment in yourself and your future.
Well, those are awesome parting words to leave with. And with that,